Hi, I'm Mike, and you've probably come across this video because, like me, you are into synthesizers and not into reading manuals, or you are considering getting a Korg Radius and you just want to know about some of the features and how it works. So this video is to really take you through building a program. This is not a complete tutorial on the system overall. There are plenty of videos out there that go through and step you through the different sound banks and the different sounds that are out there. There are a few that do some rudimentary sound design and sound shaping. I'm not going to do any of that. So what we will cover is I'll give you some general tips and tricks on general workflow. We'll talk about building a new program based on the existing timbres that are in the machine. We're going to talk about using a program that includes both the Arpeggiator as well as the two-step sequencers, and we'll make minor adjustments to the timbres that are there for preset. What we're not going to cover is anything that's around sound shaping or editing. I might make a few changes here and there, but that's not the purpose of the video. We're not going to talk at all about the Radius Sound Editor software. There's probably a lot of questions about that. It's not supported anymore, so it's gotten quite aged. Remember, the system came out in 2006. So it can still be supported on Windows 10 if you use the Radius provided MIDI adapter driver. But it is very kludgy on Mac. I've got it to work a couple of times on Mac, and then as quickly as it works, it doesn't work. So we're not going to cover really any of that here, but just give you a heads up if you're out searching for the answer there. Try it on a Windows 10 machine instead of a Mac. And we're also not going to cover anything. This is a vocoder. We're not going to cover anything for vocoding and doing any voice inputs and doing any modulation on those voice inputs. So, disclaimer before we get started, I am not a professional sound designer. I'm not a programmer of sounds. I'm a hobbyist. I just spend some time going through and tweaking and figuring these things out. I'm not going to probably be able to respond to any questions that get asked about how-tos that get posted in the comments, so don't think poorly of me if I don't respond. If I do know the answer and I see a comment, I'll absolutely give you help where I can. And one other thing I would advise, download and read the manual. The manual has a lot of, it's a manual, it's not very sexy, but it has a lot of really good information that will help you go through, even if you don't own one, if you want to get a sense for how the different things work. This is, I'll keep saying, this is a 2006 machine, so it's not as up-to-date as what we might be used to be dealing with in our digital audio workstation software, in our virtual sense, but it's certainly light years away from what you might be used to if you're used to dealing with regular analog electrical synths that are, frankly, patch cable, MS-20, the Korg MS-20 is one I'm thinking of in particular. Some of the early Moogs that have, a lot of dials and knobs. If you're used to dealing with those, well, then, this might be second nature to you, but go back to saying read the manual if you can. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So throughout the video, I'm going to be showing you two different views. I'll be showing you the view of me actually working on the Radius, and over on this side, I have my MIDI controller. Now, the Radius is designed to be a standalone unit that works, completely within its own rack module here. It is occasionally, you'll find it sold with the actual companion unit that has the keyboard controller attached to it that's got a bend and a pitch wheel and all of that. I bought it just as the Radius because I already had a MIDI controller, and it wasn't an option to me, but I wouldn't have anyway if I could have avoided it. So really all the things that you need to do, from triggering different keys on the keyboard, everything you need to do, you can do in the Radius. I just happen to use my controller to make it a little bit easier to start and stop things. So first things first, this machine, as I said in the intro, is a 2006 machine, so it's a little more advanced than what you would find in your analog synthesizers. This is a digital analog, if that makes any sense to you. It's basically synthetically trying to create the analog feel of working with analog oscillators and the different waveform types, whether they're saw or triangle or square or what have you. But this also means that because it's not as modern, and if you're used to working with digital audio workstations like Logic or Pro Tools or Cubase or something like that, it's quite a bit of ways from the Euro rack stuff, which which is requires a lot of little 3.5-inch stereo patch cables. It's somewhere in between. I have my Radius hooked up to my iMac in Logic, and as I said before, the Radius is designed to be able to be edited, triggered and played without a MIDI controller, but I do, so even though you see it, it doesn't mean you have to have it this way. You can do all of the steps that we're going to be doing, and I'll try to use the Radius as much as possible. I'm also going to repeat a few things several times because it's very easy to lose your place when you're creating a program, and you can screw things up. So I'll repeat things several times just based on my own experience of screwing things up. So let's take a quick tour of the device. As I said, it's a polyphonic virtual analog synth. Describe that as basically it's trying to emulate the electrical analog cousin of earlier synths. It is a vocoder. I won't cover, as I said in the intro also, I won't cover any of the steps of the vocoder programs, but just be advised that when you have this, you have the ability to do vocal manipulations on inputs that you do from microphones, and even some cases you can actually input audio directly in and shape that as well. It doesn't have to be directly from a microphone. You can plug something in from a different audio source. It has a small LCD interface here, and I've tried to get the focus on the camera good enough where you can see this. The screen here is pretty good on the eyes. It's pretty easy on the eyes. If you have one that's gotten a lot of use, I got the impression that the one I bought didn't have so much use to it, so it's probably a little bit crisper. I've seen some videos out there where the screen has been obviously worn down over time, which LCDs typically do, so it might be, yours might not be as crisp as this. Another thing is it's got a single large knob to the right of the screen, and this is both a blessing and a curse because it does allow you to maneuver around with your thumb pretty easily. It does allow you at a sort of a click at a time be able to get a little bit more granular. The problem that I have on mine, and why it's a curse for me, is if you start spinning it too fast, it sort of resets itself back to its first position. So you always have to make sure when you're going through, and we have some examples where you have to scroll through quite a bit to get to some things you might be looking for. So just bear in mind, this is both a blessing and a curse. The good news is that you can use a lot of the buttons and a lot of the knobs that are here to do a lot of the sort of what I'm going to call kind of broad dialing in, and then you can use this to do a little bit more. But there is not a way that I'm aware of to scroll through very large lists very quickly without just making sure that you're doing it at the appropriate speed where it doesn't want to reset on you. All right, next thing. The bottom of this is really where a lot of the experience gets driven from. It's these 16 knobs and these 16 buttons. We'll go through and we'll talk about how you can use these for multiple different uses. But they're also going to be driven by primarily this section over here that says 16 keys. One thing from just a general tour of the machine, if you'll notice, there are black lines that really divide out what is happening with a lot of these buttons. And when you first look at it, it looks like it belongs in the cockpit of a 747. I get it. If you're used to dealing with devices that have lots of knobs, it's probably pretty easy for you to look at it and say, oh, my oscillators feed into a mixer, which goes to my filters. If you're not as used to it and you're diving into this machine relatively new, think about it in terms of different sections, and the section is really, there is a flow to the way that sounds move through a synthesizer. In this particular case, we have oscillators that generate the initial sound. They get mixed together in the mixer section. You can apply one, or in this case, two filters. And you can do those filters in a series of different ways. You can do them as single. You can do them as serial, where they're one after the other. You can do them in parallel or at the same time. So we won't get a whole lot into manipulating with the filters, but just keep in mind that we're moving from left to right here. Also, if you'll notice on the buttons, as you start getting into the areas down here, when we get into oscillators, filters, amps, EG, LFO, low frequency oscillator, there is a kind of a definite flow as you work through, and you're working from left to right. So as you get into doing more sound editing, wave shaping, that sort of thing, it'll become very important to you. But it's also, for the purposes of this exercise, it's important that you kind of keep your mind on the fact that each of these different sections have something to do with the sound, and there's a logical flow to it. Another thing I'll point out here is that while we have this big knob that, as I said, helps us navigate. We also can get to any of the individual sections just by turning a knob. And once we have to be in the edit mode, of course. I'll get to that in a second. But as we turn these knobs, we can actually edit the sounds, and this screen right here will change in corresponding with the knobs. So that's enough on that. What I do want to call out here is I'm talking about these 16 buttons and 16 knobs. These 16 buttons are tied to what you have selected here for what you're going to be using. So when I talk about triggers and I talk about pages or using the 16 buttons as the actual keyboard, so let's say that I did not have this guy over here, my MIDI controller. As I go back to the keyboard, well, I have that power through the controllers talking to the radius and making that sound off. But if I am without a MIDI controller, I can actually change this and I can select keyboard. And if you'll notice, what it's doing is it's starting off with these actually being keys of the keyboard. You'll notice that every so often you'll have a black underline that goes around the button. Well, that's to represent the black keys on the keyboard. And when you are in an octave 0 position, this is actually C4 on what would be your keyboard. This is C4. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these are not velocity sensitive. They don't have any aftertouch. They're just a raw, what you hit is what you get. Now, if I wanted to be lower than C4 and I wanted to come down here, I wanted to come down an octave on my controller, I just come down an octave and I hit it. So there will be steps in here where we want to use the keyboard to trigger the sounds within the radius. There are other times I'll just use the keyboard because it's more intuitive and I'm more used to it. Another thing that you'll want to look at is when you're on program, that's when you're actually able to navigate your programs. When you navigate with the dial, as I said, you can scroll, and if you scroll too fast, you're going to, mind reset your mind. That just might be a glitch on mine when you go too fast. It just, doesn't move very far. But another thing that you can do when you're navigating the different banks within the radius is you can use your program bank buttons down here. When you're in program mode, you actually, if you'll notice, I'm now up into B, I'm up to C, D, E, F, G, all the way up to P. And when I hit a program button, if let's say I'm looking for a sound that happens to be in N6, and I come here and I just hit N6. You'll do this a lot when you're looking into your area where you're storing your own sounds. All of that lives up in the P range. So you will have these where you can hit, and you can just go directly to those no matter where you are. You find the right, with these buttons, you find the right letter category, and then you find the right number combination there. When you are in trigger, you can only select trigger and page when you're in edit mode. I'll go into that in just a second and show you that. But what this does is it allows you to tell the radius when you're in edit mode, especially when you're dealing with the arpeggiators and the step sequencers, which beat, if you've set up where you're doing 16 or 32 or 8 beats for the resolution, it allows you to use these buttons to trigger which ones are turned on and which ones are turned off. And that'll become a little bit more evident when we get into the example. The page is actually going into the individual programming sections for individual sounds. So if I'm going to go into edit mode here, and we're on this particular program, which is called Moisture EP. If I come into edit mode here and I make sure I have this set to page, what I'm going to do is as I go through, it has the name above the button of what page I'm going to. So this is the name page, and you'll see here it says page 1. And you come through and you'll go to page 2. Now some of these have multiple tabs in their pages, so when you hit it multiple times, you'll go through and you'll scroll through as you hit multiple times. It's pretty straightforward in programming mode. The one thing to call out is when you are actually starting to deal with your arpeggiators and your step sequencers, as well as your mod sequencers, is that if you don't have one selected, you'll actually see not selected. And sometimes that can get confusing, and we'll cover later why that is. But this is a trouble area for me. I still, as much as I play around with this thing, I still will say, what do you mean I don't have a arpeggiator selected? It's because I'm on a wrong timbre that doesn't have it assigned, or I actually don't have it turned on, and I think that I do. So while we're here, let's talk about the different programs that are already loaded into the Radius. As I said, we have a total of 16 banks, so from 1 to 16 or from A to P. Each of those banks are pre-programmed with something from Radius except for bank 16. Bank 16 is sort of our playground, and we'll talk about that when it comes to actually setting up a program for ourselves. But each of these programs can also hold 4 different timbres within a particular program. So as you scroll through and you're taking a look at different programs that are in the machine, you'll actually notice that the number of timbres are changing. Now, that's timbre select here. You actually can, when you get into editing mode and you get into doing different things, you'll need to make sure that these are selected. And I know it's spelled like it looks like it's timbre, but it's timbre. Just that's the way it is. So you can have up to 4, or you can have up to 3 timbres that are instrumentation, and you can have 1 that is a drum. And we'll get into setting up and assigning drums. It's a little bit less intuitive to do the drum assignments there. So with that, let's talk a little bit about our area that we're going to spend quite a bit of time in. Let me get out of edit mode, and let me make sure that I am set on program, and I'm going to come up here to P. And P is a user category named user, and all of the programs, when you get yours, if it's been reset or cleaned out, all of your programs are going to say init program. And this is the initialized program where you have the basic initialized timbre set into spot 1, and it is just a basic sound. You can just keyboard. So the idea here is if you wanted to start from scratch, you could start with this, and you could start changing the different, you could edit it, you could change the different waveforms, you could start creating your own sounds. We're not going to actually do that, but that's kind of where you started. And I guess that's it. So let's talk a little bit about kind of navigating a program. So one of the things that we want to do to start with is we want to get used to the different programs that are already installed into the Radius. We're going to take a tour around to some of the different ones. I'm starting here, of course, with the pole position sound. And as I go through and I start to navigate, I'm starting to notice that I have these different programs are made up of up to 4 different timbres. Sometimes they'll just use 3 of the 4 slots. Sometimes they'll use 2 or 1 of the slots. But as you go through and you start taking a look at some of these different programs, you'll notice a couple of different things. One of them is that you'll see a little A next to some of them. That means that in that program, the arpeggiator is turned on. In others, you'll see that it has a number. In this case, it has a 2, which means we're using the 2nd step sequencer, and we are doing a drum kit in that particular timbre slot. So as you go through and you're looking at different sounds, you'll kind of want to start getting a sense for how these are constructed. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to D2, and I'm actually going to choose program. I'm going to come up to D. I'm going to hit button 2, or I could have just turned the dial to get there. But we're going to turn the arpeggiator on because we know the arpeggiator is in use and it's not on by default on. When it's not on by default, when you hit the keys, you still get a sound based on where you've hit the key, but you're not really getting the full experience because it really wants to use the arpeggiator and the step sequencer. So by turning on the arpeggiator and step sequencer, we're able to actually get what is intended for the program. we'll turn that off. So if I want to know what's happening within this particular program, I have the ability to actually mute different parts of this particular program. So I can come in here and by holding down exit, no, I can start to deselect things that I don't want to turn on with this timbre select portion down here. Anytime you see the light blinking on a timbre, that's where the little arrow will be next to, and that will indicate what your active timbre is. I can't choose timbres that are turned off. I can only choose timbres that are turned on. So if I hit this exit and re-choose, or re-turn on these, and then I can come and I can then move this across here. But right now I want to preview and I just want to listen to what each of these different voices are giving me. So in this particular one, I want to make sure I'm just hearing the first one. And that's the driver. Usually your first timbre is going to be the driver of the sequence. Something else I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the second, turning off the first. So on this second timbre, when I want to go through, I need to make sure that I have the arpeggiator and step sequencer turned on because this track is reliant, where the first one wasn't, this track is reliant on that step sequencer. And another thing to look out for, if you'll notice, as I'm going through and hitting these buttons, nothing's happening, even though I have this turned on. That's because when you're doing a program, and we'll cover this when we're setting up our program, you have the ability to turn different keys on and off for a particular timbre within your program. So I'm going to move over here because it's easier to show rather than hitting all of the octave buttons. But if you'll notice here, I'm not able to actually trigger this particular timbre until I get down into this range. Once I get to, what's that, E3, I'm able to trigger it, and it'll just repeat on that. And this is a... That's one thing you want to make sure that you're doing, because as you, it's a little bit easier when you're dealing with a controller as opposed to when you're using the buttons here, because you could very easily think, oh, this is not creating any sound. So now let's listen to our third timbre. This one needs the arpeggiator on, so we make sure that's turned on. And this one's also a weird one. This is, again, the reason I chose D2, because it's got some weirdness to it. I have this turned on. I'm going to use my controller to trigger it. You'll notice there's a little bit of a delay there. Now, that delay is built in intentionally, and because it's set on latch, I don't have to hold the key anymore. It'll actually just play. But that's part of the overall program sound. You don't have the bass happening all the time. So let's go ahead and turn that off, and let's listen for the drum patch now. So we're going to turn off 2 and 3. We're going to turn on 4. I'm going to select 4. You don't have to select, I just do, because that's usually what I'm selecting is what I'm going to be working on next. We're going to turn on the arpeggiator and step sequencer, because number 2 says that it uses that. And chances are the drums are also set to a zone, so we're just going to go ahead and trigger it. Interesting thing about drum kits you'll learn is that this one's set to do what's called a key sync, where it goes through and restarts itself every time I hit a key. But these also don't transpose. They're the same no matter what key you hit in the range. And if you'll see this one, it doesn't matter what range I'm in, I'm able to actually trigger it. So one other thing as you're going through and you are previewing different sounds and different programs that are in here, and this is an important thing, is that these programs are intended to run together. So there can be syncing issues once you start turning things on and off. This one might be that way. I know most of the ones that I come across that I'm listening to and turning things on and off, when I turn everything back on and I go to play it, sometimes it's perfectly in sync. And that's because the key sync is turned on. When you have a arpeggiator sequence where key sync is not turned on, because as I said earlier, if you remember, every time I hit the key, it starts over. So this one's not going to have a sync issue. but you're going to come across some that do. And I'm going to highlight this sync issue later when we're building our program, but it's just something to be on the lookout for. That's it for our quick tour through the buttons and how we get in and deal with programs, how we look at different programs, how we highlight them. We haven't gotten into any editing yet. We're just looking at navigating around and using the different buttons. And again, just a quick refresh, these buttons and these dials are going to be very important to you as we're going through and doing some changes in editing. And this select key is also going to be important, as is this octave key, if you're going to be using the keyboard here to make sure that you're getting in the right range. So let's move on to the next thing. We're going to start and we're going to build our own program. So I've already built the program up in my space. Let's go up to make sure this is on program. Let's navigate up to P, which is the user space, and we are going to go to 6. I've named this one ARP and Steps because this is a tutorial about how to build a program that uses both the arpeggiator and both sequencers, step sequencers. So very important as we get started here. We are going to be making writes to the internal Radius memory. And in order to do that, we have to turn off the memory protect. Now, the good news here is that you have to write changes intentionally, and it'll ask you, are you sure, before you can write things. That's good, so you don't screw things up. But it's also bad because you can screw things up a different way by doing a lot of work in editing, getting things tweaked and sounding just right, and then you turn the knob or you do something to change the program and you lose all those changes. So like with anything else, whether it's a Microsoft Word document or a Excel PowerPoint or whatever program you normally use, save frequently. There is no autosave function on this. So we're going to come into our global settings. This is the first time we've entered into global. We're going to make sure that we're on page so that we can see all the global settings. But if you just do a quick tour through the different buttons, there's a lot of different things in here. We'll not really cover much of these. One thing I do want to bring you to, though, is page 2 for memory. And this by default is on. You want to turn it to off just by moving the cursor down to it. It'll start off on it, but if it doesn't, you move the cursor to it and you make it go from on to off. This allows us to write. Now, if you happen to hit the right button and you're trying to save something, it will tell you you have memory protect turned on. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to turn this to memory protect on. I'm going to come back out of global into my program, and I'm going to try to edit, and I'm going to try to write this. It's going to say error. I can't do that because you have memory protect turned on. So that's the worst thing that's going to happen. When you get out of this and you say, okay, I get it, exit, and you want to hit global, you're still in your program, so you're not in any fear of changing it. So we're going to turn this off, and we're going to hit yes to save it, and then we're going to hit exit. Then we'll go back in to make sure that it's saved, and it did. So we hit exit, and here we are. So this is our completed program that we're going to build up during this tutorial. So I'm going to play it for you quickly. I'm going to use the trigger keys to do it. This one is not zoned out, so we can play it on any key, and we're going to play it. That is our reference that we're going to use to go back and we're going to build this up step by step. The first thing we're going to do before we get into building our program with the arpeggiator and the step sequencers is I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to input data into the Radius. As you can imagine, with all these knobs and all these buttons, it's not as easy as just click and type something in. There's no keyboard, as you can see, and there's no representation of letters to click on. So a lot of the input is done, or all of the input is done turning things. But if you try to, and I'll show you what happened for me. So for example, let's do two things. The first thing I want to do is I want to actually go back into global because I like to customize things, and having a category called user just doesn't make me feel good. So I'm going to go into global, and I'm going to make sure that I'm set to page, and I'm going to come through here and I'm going to find the one that tells me what my categories are. And it's page 10, category name. So if you'll notice, all of the timbres that we have, as we scroll through and we look at these, all of the timbres that we have, they all have a category assigned to them. This helps if you're looking for a bass sound, if you're looking for an arpeggiator or a motion sequence. This gives you a good way to navigate what the sounds are. As I said though, as we get into our user, I don't like user, so I want to change that name. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to go to page 10. I'm going to come up to 16, which is the last group. There's our lucky number 16, 8, 32. All this stuff is tied to that 8-bit. I want to be able to change this. So I just cursor over. Now, normally, and when I first got this thing, I would go through and I would find one letter, and I'd find the next letter, and I'd find the next letter, and find the next letter, and then I'd put a space. So they've actually made it a little bit easier for you. It's easier. It's not the easiest as just clicking on something and going it. But you will use the edit keys and the cursor keys and some of the dials. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear this out. And the way I'm going to clear it out is I'm going to hold down edit, and I'm just going to hit cursor backwards. And if you'll notice, it all goes away. So it's all cleared out here. So what we want to do to be able to fill this in, now bear in mind, we can use this to go through and scroll and find special characters, numbers. That's way too tedious. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to be able to add our letters and numbers and spaces, all that pretty easily. So one way that we can do that, and again, using this edit, hold down the edit button, we're going to be able to use the first 12 of these knobs to be able to dial in number, dial in letter, uppercase and lowercase, special characters, all of that. To hold down edit, then if you'll look, we're going to start turning this, and then we start seeing a different thing. So if I want to basically say that, I want to have a capital letter there, and then I want to have, the minute I touch the second one and start turning it, it's going to save whatever's in the previous. Look at that, and I can get that, and so I want to do a lowercase number, and then I want to do a space, and then I want to do a number in the fourth space, so I'll start turning that, and I'll just go until I can find a number. So that's certainly one way to do it, but even that is, with so many letters and numbers, is a little bit tedious. So I'm going to go back to my first position, hold down edit, I'm going to clear these out again, and I'm actually going to use the last 4. So I have my first 12 of my 16 knobs. I'm going to use the last 4 to actually dial in specifically whether I want a capital letter, whether I want a lowercase letter, whether I want a number or a special character. So this is my category for my personal stuff. So I'm just going to come back here, and I'm going to clear that out. I'm going to hold down edit, and I'm just going to turn the fourth one because I want a capital letter, and I'm going to come down to the letter M because my name's Mike, and I'm going to put my last initial in here, and I'm going to make that capital as well. It's going to remember the last letter I was on to start with. Because it thinks it's cute doing that. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. I'm going to do another uppercase letter. I'm going to make it a uppercase L, and then I'm going to come over here, hold edit. I'm going to use a lowercase now, so I'm going to go to this button, and I'm going to go down to the letter A. I'm going to hit it over, and then I'm going to hold on edit. I'm going to go back to the lowercase button, and because I was on A, I just turn up once, and I'm on B, and away we go. So I will edit, I will save that, and when I exit global, and I go back to my program, my category now says MHLab. This is the same way that we're going to change the name of the program that we're working on. It's a good idea to generally start when you are going to work on a program. If you're just toying around and messing with a sound, you don't. But if you know that you're going to start building a program, it's a good idea to keep all of your INIT programs, try to keep them where you know what's what. I'm very big about hygiene, so I'm going to go through, and I'm actually going to change the name of this particular program to be what I want it to be. Or what I usually do is I go down to 16 and I start building them back. So I always have, I know how many I have left based on this. The question is going to be, how do I move them around? How do I save them offline? That's a whole different topic. For that, you do need to have the Korg sound editor software that I said we weren't going to cover here. That's the way you make copies of all of the binary information in the Radius to be able to save them offline. Maybe one day, if there are more than 6 people who watch this video and you want to see it, I can pull it up and I can do a video on it, but I'm not going to cover it here. So let's go ahead and let's change the name of this particular timbre. And our reference, if you remember, is this guy right here. That's our reference, and that's 6. So we're just going to build the same thing. So we're going to go back to 16, and we're going to go to edit. So this is the first time we've really entered into the editing mode of any of the timbres, because this is the first time we're really doing any editing. So if you'll notice, the very first thing it gives me when I go into edit mode is it gives me the first page of editing. It actually gives me the second tab. Yours might start off and show you the first tab. Mine sometimes will start off in totally different places, but you'll want to go to 1 for name, and you'll want to make sure that it's on the prog tab to actually put the name of your program. You'll hold down edit, and we'll just wipe this bad boy out. And if you remember from the step we just did, I'm using these 4 keys down here, so I'm going to come down here, I'm going to go A, and I'm going to come over, and I'm going to hold this down, and I'm going to go lowercase r. I'm going to come over again, and I was just on R, so I should, on that lowercase, just be able to get to P pretty easily. And then I'm going to come over here. Now I want to put in a special character, and the special character is my last, so I'm going to look for the ampersand. And then I'm going to come over here, I'm going to do another capital letter. I'm going to do another lowercase letter. So, as I said, it's tedious. It's not as simple as just typing something in, but it's a lot easier than trying to use this wheel and the cursor for everything. It's even, in my mind, easier than using those knobs there. So now that I have that set, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell it I want to write, and it's going to say, are you sure you want to write? Sure. I haven't really made any changes to the name, so I am sure. I hit edit yes, it writes, and I'm right back where I am. So now when I come out of editing and I'm back in my program mode, and go to 15, go to 14. If you'll notice, I come back to 16. Arp and Steps 2 is saved. This is my reference, Arp and Steps. This is our program that we're going to build up from. So as I said earlier, we are going to build, and Arp and Steps is made up of timbres that already exist within the Radius. I didn't do wave shaping and editing to start off with this. If you're that person and you can do that, great. You can use basically any timbre that you save in the machine can be referenced back to, so you can do that. You'll be able to do it once you see how we're going to start pulling some sounds in. So our first step is we are going to go into edit mode, but before we do that, we need to know what timbres we're going to put in. Our first step here is let's just go find some sounds. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going through and picking different, why I choose different sounds. But what I'll do is I'll go to a couple of different sounds specifically that I used, so you can get a sense for, where the sounds came from. I'm going to come down to B and I'm going to hit 2. And B2 is called minimal. And as you listen to minimal, it's set up and it's a nice, funky arpeggiated synth template, and I like it, but I don't want everything. I don't want the drums right now. I don't want this T2 synth. So I'm going to do what we did earlier is I want to listen to just that minimal ARP. And I'm going to turn off this, and I'm going to turn off this, and I'm going to say, okay, does it still get me what I want? Using the keyboard over here. Yep, I like that. That sounds good. So I'm just going to do nothing other than remember that this exists within B2 minimal and it's timbre number 1. If I move off of this and I come back, it's going to forget that I told it to mute those, so nothing got permanently changed. So that's one we're going to use. We're going to use the timbre 1 from B2. But I like, with my arpeggiated sequences, I like not just that synth bumping of the arpeggiator, I like a little bit of scratchiness and a little scratchy sound to it. So I went and I found within J2, and it's coincidentally a 2, but I'm going to come up here to Program, I'm going to move my way up to J2, and I'm going to listen to this. Yeah, I like that. But I don't want all of it. I know I want kind of a scratchy noise, and I'm pretty sure it's probably timbre 4. So I'm going to come down here and turn off these guys. Make sure that's still on. And I like that. It's got some motion to it. It's scratchy. It'll add a little bit of color and flavor to what I'm wanting to do with my art. So let's go ahead and make note of that. Timbre 4 of program J2. We had timbre 1 of B2 earlier. And let's actually move those into our program. I want to, in my program, I want to come back up to P. And if you remember, we were P16. I'm going to go into Edit. Again, pages are important. If you go into edit mode and you're not on page, you will need to change just by doing this. Sometimes you'll be on trigger, sometimes you'll be on page or keyboard. You cannot access program from within edit, so it'll just let you choose the things that you need. And right now, these red buttons are all the pages that are available to us. So we've already talked about the first one, which is the program for name 1. Hit it again, I'm looking at the actual timbres that are there. But really what I want to do is I want to go to the third page, which is the actual timbre screen. And I want to go to the first page of timbre. But this is where I actually set where the timbres are. Now the interesting thing here is, as I said, it's going to default to an initiated timbre that's just, I believe, a saw sequence. Without any effects, anything. It's very plain. But what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're actually going to be able to do a couple things. One thing we can do is as we start to scroll right with our wheel here, you'll see TMP and numbers. These are actually templates that the Radius has, so you don't have to start your sounds from scratch. And there's a variety of different templates in there. There's saw basses. There's some different sound effects. There's some different things. I'm going to turn it over to keyboard. So they're just different sounds that you can start with. So that's what happens if you turn to the right. If you come down from your initial sequence and you begin to start turning to the left, this is where you get into the different timbres of your programs. So it's starting off with, I'm in P16, so it's going to start with P15 timbre 1, and as you scroll through, it'll give you options for, oh, there's timbre 3 for P8, there's timbre 2 for P8. As you're going through, you'll just see different timbres. So if you remember, B2 timbre 1 is what I really want. I'm all the way in O. I haven't found an easier way to get down from here, so I just kind of scroll it and hope. So here we are at B2. I liked that sound. The sound is now loaded into my timbre one from B2's timbre one, and I feel good about that. So what I'm going to do is, because I've got it moved there, I don't want to run the risk of moving anything off. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write, and I'm going to say yes, right, and now I have that saved in here. So if I get out of edit mode and I'm looking at just my program, and let's say that I switch this to program, and I decide I want to come to this program, I go back to this, see, minimal ARP saved there. So if I want to play it, what I'm going to hear, and I'm not going to use the keyboard on the Radius because I have to use a velocity to really get you to hear it, but what I'm going to do, it's the sound, and there's some motion, there's some modulation of sound, but the power of that sound comes from being able to put it into an arpeggiator. It's interesting to call out when you are pulling in timbres from different programs, they will not inherit their arpeggiator, they will not, any step sequencing that's specific to that program will not come with it. The only thing that will come is that timbre and any effects that may be on that particular timbre. So keep that in mind as you're moving sounds in. So now it's time to set this thing up into the arpeggiator. So going into edit mode, we are on timbre 1, which is called minimal ARP. So what we want to do is just set this up for a very simple arpeggiator sequence. We want to make sure that we are on page for the program. We want to make sure that we are down here with our page buttons, and where we want to go is page 14, and we want to go to arpeggiator. Now, when you first look at this, it's going to say not selected because for this particular timbre, which is timbre number 1, you have not assigned the arpeggiator to that particular timbre. So we're going to reach over here and we're going to hit the select button and we're going to say arpeggiator. Now it lights up. It gives us some options. We're also going to want to turn the arpeggiator on, because if we don't turn that on, when we play it to test it, we won't hear it. And when we save it, it won't be defaulted on. Now there are some sequences in some programs you might want to not have the arpeggiator turned on immediately when you come into the program. This one we're going to do it. So we're going to make sure that timbre 1, arpeggiator on, and it's selected to arpeggiator. So earlier we were listening to the minimal ARP sound in B2. It was actually set to a clock speed of 140 BPM. Your program is going to default to 120, and that was fine. I could change it if I wanted to, but the sound I want is around 120, so I'm going to leave it there. Another thing that you're going to want to think about is whether or not you want key sync on. Earlier I talked about how the different programs, when they are interacting with the arpeggiator and the step sequences, whether or not the key sync is turned on or off will dictate how that program wants to run. So in this particular case, we're actually going to make sure that our key sync is turned off, because I don't want the start of the sequence to be triggered by the key starting. I want it to, as I flow across the different steps of the arpeggiator, I want it to sync together with that in the steps of the sequencer. So I want that off. I'm going to go ahead and leave up, but I'm going to sweeten this up a little bit, and I'm going to say that I want 2 octaves. I like the resolution of 1/16. The last step of this particular arpeggiator is 16. Again, I can dial that resolution down to make it a shorter sequence that plays more frequently, or I can lengthen it out and I can actually make this I can make this a 32 in resolution, and I can make this and I can change this up to 32 as well. Not going to do it. I'm going to keep everything right here for our purposes. You can experiment on your own, play with that and see what you like. Another thing I'm going to tell you is right here for triggers. When you're going through a arpeggiator, you need to be able at each step to be able to tell the Radius whether you want that step to be on or off. And it really is binary. If you look at this, that means it's off. You look at the round circle, that means it's on. It's as simple as that. This is where you get into your trigger buttons. We'll use them in because we're going to have it wide open on this one. When we get into our step sequencer, that's when we're actually going to be using our triggers. But if you'll notice, as I'm hitting 1 through 16 steps, as I'm hitting these buttons, it's actually triggering off in the sequence. But I just want it all on. I'm fine with this particular one for it to be all on. One other thing I'm going to call out here is when you are setting up either the arpeggiator or the step sequences, when you get into looking at the steps, so if you'll go back here, we have them all turned on. This gives you more detail about every individual step in the sequence. If you'll notice, they're all the same. Gate time is the amount of time that goes by before it applies sort of a stop and gate to go to the in with the next sequence, how much it continues on. The longer your gate, the more open your gate is, so more sound will get through. You cut it shorter, the gate time will activate pretty quickly, so it'll be choppier. It's set at 50 by default. I'll leave it at 50. I'm fine with that. For velocity, this is an important thing to call out. Velocity, when it's set to key, means it will play the sound and it'll play the sequence based on how hard the key is hit. If you have a touch-sensitive controller, if you're using just the trigger buttons on the Radius, no matter how hard you hit them, it's going to be the same. If you use your controller and you really put some power into it, you're going to hear it a little bit louder. Now, sometimes you want your sequence to be touch sensitive, other times you don't. If you want it to be a steady volume all the way throughout, this is where you're going to come through and you're going to set that. And for this particular sound, I like to set it not at its full volume of 127. I'll pull it back a little bit. This is the loudest thing in the sequence. I want this to drive. The issue that we have is I'm on step 12 making the change. I now have to go make this change on every single step, which is tedious. You'll hear me say that word a lot because I believe it's true. So let me go through and very quickly reset all these and I'll speed it up. Okay, so we've got all of our steps set at a velocity of 125. So they're going to play consistently at the same volume no matter what I hit and how hard I hit it. So to test that out really quickly, come back here. I'm going to make sure to sit on keyboard and I'm going to hit. So no matter how hard I hit it, it's still going. Okay, so we've now put in our steps for our arpeggiated sequence on Tamper 1. We've got it set up the way that we want it to be, so we're just going to come over here and we're going to say right and we're going to say yes, and we have now, if we come back out here to the program, we are now successfully saved where we have our sound, our timbre, with an arpeggiator assigned to it. Let's just come up here for giggles, move it off, come back, and you see that we've successfully saved. So now when we hit our key, hit our keyboard over here, we're good to go on that sound. So that's the first step in setting up this sequence. Okay, we're now going to move our second timbre in. If you recall earlier, that was from J2, and it was timbre number 4 that we moved in, and that was just called ARP noise. So like we did the last time, we're going to come into here, and we're going to hit edit. One thing to note, and this is a very important thing, this is probably, as I might have already said, my #1 error that I make, is I don't make sure that the right timbres are selected or turned on. So before I go into edit, what I'm going to do, or as I come into edit, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to make sure my page is turned on. I'm going to go to my timbre page, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to turn that on. Then I can actually add it. This will become important as you get to trying to select different timbres, or if you are, as you'll see later when we're adding the drums in, if you don't have that timbre turned on, it won't move it into the right position. So turn it on, and here we're going to work back to J2. Fortunately, that's closer, so it's not going to take a long time to get there. So we're going to J2, and we are going to timbre number 4. There we go, arm noise. So we're good. So we know that we have it in the right place. It's on our timbre page right here. So let's go ahead and write that into the position. So let's go ahead and hit write. Let's hit yes. Let's get out of edit mode just to double check. And there we have it right here. Let's move one program down. Let it load, come back, and we have our arp noise. So we're ready to get this one set up into sequencer number 1. So if you'll notice, we are back to our program here. We have our 2 timbres that are here that we can select. We have nothing assigned to 3 or 4. And we want to now go through and we want to add the step sequencer into timbre 2. So one thing we'll want to make sure that we do is make sure that the number 2 is blinking, because that's the timbre that we've selected. Number one mistake I make is that I forget which timbre I'm making edits to, and I inadvertently will screw something up because I have the wrong timbre selected. So it's just a good idea to make sure you know you're working on that particular timbre. So before we get into setting the step sequencer up, I want to listen to the sounds exclusively for that timbre. So I do not want to listen to timbre 1. So I'm not blowing it away, I'm not deleting it, I'm just turning it off while I exit 1, which is what we talked about earlier when we're previewing sounds. It works the same way to mute them within your own programs. So right now I'm just going to be listening to the arp noise. When I have this set to keyboard, as I hit this, I can hear the sound. The thing that I want you to notice about this particular sound is that it is pretty much the same sound no matter what I hit. And it cycles through a frequency modulation. So what I'm going to do is when I go through to program this sequence, I'm just going to hit one key. That's how I'm going to activate it. When you're using sequences that actually have notes, you will put the keys in there. I'll show you how that works because it works the same way here. But if you'll notice, when we go into edit, we want to make sure we're on page. We're going to go to step sequencer. If you'll notice, it says not selected because like the arpeggiator, it will not show any information until we are selecting the arpeggiator for the timbre that we have in selection mode. So we are going to come here and we're going to say step sequencer 1. It's going to come to life. You'll see here that it's set up very similar to the arpeggiator in that we have a different number of our steps. Within run mode, you can choose whether you want it to be a loop, a step, or a one-shot. We're going to choose loop because we want this to be continue a loop. There might be cases where you put up a arpeggiator or a step sequence that is run through once and you don't want to hear it again, so that would be a one-shot. There are also some cases where you might want to just hear the number of steps for as long as you hold down the key, and that's the step. We are going to go to the loop. Important thing in editing, I haven't called this out before because we haven't really gotten too much into editing, but Radius will remember the original value for any particular parameter that's given. And when you get more into experimenting with different sounds and effects and things like that, if you're using one that already exists, this light right here is incredibly helpful. It's the original value light. So right now it knows when I came into the step sequencer that the run mode variable was already set to loop. If you'll notice, it goes off when I start making some changes, but every time I come back to what it originally started at, it lights up. Very, very helpful when you're tweaking around. You want to make sure that you're not making changes that you don't remember. So I know that I want to have my resolution much like I do my arpeggiator at 1/16. Transpose, this is where we get into transposing the sequence based on the notes that you're pressing. In this particular case, because this timbre doesn't change as I'm going through and hitting the keys because it's all triggered on the same modulation, I don't really need to turn it on. But if I did something, again, with a particular melody, let's say that I went through and I had something that was a C chord, well, if I have transpose turned on, then I'm able to basically say, oh, well, my bass note is C4, and then it will automatically, as you hit different keys, it will adjust the key of that particular sequence to be able to match the key that you're in. It's not necessary here for this one, so I'm going to turn it off, but bear in mind, if you start having sequences where you get the same thing every time you hit a key, that's your problem. You'll come back and you'll change that to on. Another thing that we're going to look at is on gates times and swing time. Swing time is within a step sequence. It gives it a little bit of a looser feel. It's not as precise in time. You'll sometimes have a little bit of an offset on swing, sometimes a lot. It depends on the sound that you're looking for. I'm leaving these both 0. And this is an important thing to think about when you're thinking about your arpeggiated sequences and your step sequencers. Setting your top and bottom keys that you will use. By default, the Radius and a lot of synthesizers, when you set up zoning for the keyboard, so all the way from C1 all the way up to G9, which you can't even see on the screen over here, that's the default. But in certain cases, and I showed you one earlier where I actually had a program that was only triggered to do bass down here and drums down here, and it had a different sound mapped up here. Well, this is where you would set for this particular step sequencer. Now, this is not for the overall timbre, it's for the step sequencer. This is where it would be activated within this particular range. We'll talk in a second about how to set it for the actual. I can do it now. Go to Page, come down here to Timbre, and you go to Zone. So right here, my zone is C1 through G9. Now, if I changed it here and I decided that I wanted this to not be C1, I wanted it to be D1, and that's the zone for that particular thing, when I come back up to step sequencer, I want to make sure that I change this to D1 as well. But I'm going to keep it at C1, original value. We're going to go back to timbre zone. We're going to change that back to C1, original value. We're happy. We're ready to go. So the thing that we want to do now is we want to come here and we want to see that we have our triggers all set up and all ready, and we want to turn our arpeggiator on, because remember, we want it to remember to be in the, for whenever the program is loaded, that step sequencer 1 is automatically on. We'll get to what latch means in a second. Sometimes you'll have latch on, sometimes you won't. But for this particular one, we won't, because we only want the sound to hear when we press the key down. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through and we're going to listen to what this sounds like. I'm going to go ahead and use the keyboard on this to just get us started. So if I want to hear what it sounds like without me just doing this, I'm going to hit latch on now. So now when I hit a key, it's just going to run continually. So that doesn't really sound, I mean, it's okay, but it's very noisy because it's happening at every single step that's happening here. So I'm going to change this to trigger, and I'm going to find what I think is probably a pretty good mix for that. I don't want this to be a driving sound. I want this to augment what I had in timbre 1. So let's go ahead and let's turn off 1 and 2. And you'll start hearing it making a change. Okay. Okay, so I have 3, I have 5, I have 8, I have 9, I have 11, 12, and 13. That feels good to me. I like that. I'm going to have that be my sound. So let's go ahead and give this a listen. Let's make sure that we have this turned on. We're going to go ahead and turn latch on as well, because we want it to sound off even when we're not pressing a keyboard. I'm going to change this to keyboard. I'm going to hit that, and we can hear our sequence. All right, so we're going to turn that off to make it stop. We're going to turn latch off. We're going to turn this back on before we save it. But one thing we want to make sure that we do is we want to make sure we turn this back to page. We come back to timbre. We go back to our first tab of timbre, and we come back up here because we're going to save. We want it to save with our first timbre turned on. And I inadvertently hit a key to make that happen. So we're going to come here. We're going to exit. We're going to see that we have A1 for timbre 1 and 2. We're good to go. We're going to write. Hit yes. And now when we come back and we load a different program, when we come back, we're still where we need to be. We come over here, we hit the key, and we're now going to hear both sounds together. One thing to keep in mind when you are doing, and I mentioned a couple of different times, this particular patch for ARP noise does not have a transposition to it. It doesn't change. It's just a constant sound no matter what key you hit. If you want to take a look at, and you want to see, we want to make sure that we are going to select timbre 2. And if you'll notice when I select timbre 2, arrow moves down. It now shows that we're in step sequencer 1. We're going to come over here to our page, and we're going to hit step sequencer. It's going to go to 1 first. It's going to show us where our triggers are turned on, where I turned them on earlier and turned off the other ones. Another thing you'll notice here is that it's going to have, in this step, it's going to have, like we saw with the arpeggiator, the step number, gate time, and key. Now this is where I changed earlier. I changed this to be 125 because our timbre 1 was our driving timbre. Here, we might want to dial this back just a little bit. Maybe let's make this 120. We don't want it to overpower. Let's make it 122. We don't want it to overpower it. We want it to sound pretty good in the mix. So we're going to change this to 122, but we're going to have to change it for every single step. Okay, so we got all of our steps in our sequence changed to be a velocity of 122. I even set it for the ones that are the triggers are turned off just in case I decide to turn them back on one day. So be mindful of that. And if anybody knows a better way to get all of these changed easier, that's not using the editing software. I know that I can do it with sliders on the editing software, but within the Radius, just drop a comment and say, hey, Mike, you're an idiot. Okay. So let's go. We've got that set all up. So we're going to come back here. We're going to go ahead and we know that we are set properly. We've got our step sequencer on. We're just going to do another write because we have changed those values. And we're going to say yes, and we feel good about that. So let's exit, and let's go back to our sound. I'll change the keyboard here. So now you can hear the driving arpeggiator noise, and you can also hear the scratchiness and the depth that you're getting from that particular step sequence. So one other thing I want to do is I want to make a change to that first timbre. When I'm listening to it on my end, and I've got some pretty decent studio speakers set up here for my music station. I'm not hearing the type of low end that I want from this minimal ARP sound, so I'm going to go and make a change to it. It's one of the few changes I'll make to the actual setting. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come back into Edit. Here, I'm going to make sure that timbre 1 is selected, blinking light. Yes, it is. And then I'm going to make sure I'm on page. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to find the one that is EQ and FX. So this is where I get a view of my equalizer that's tied to high and low. So it's not a multi-band equalizer. It's pretty simple, high and low. I'll have my FX1, FX2, master effects, which I don't have any turned on. But I'm just going to look at this right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and I'm going to make it just a little bit of a change to my gains. So for this one, I'm going to choose high gain, so I'm going to choose the high knob, and I'm just going to turn it up. I'm going to bump it a little. I don't want too much high-end noise there. This is where this is actually a pretty good tool for precise. It's very hard to kind of dial in precisely what you want on those. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to come down to low. This is where I really want that sound to come from. So I'm going to go low, and I'm going to bump this up to, let's say, 11.5. So now, when I hit my sound, I should hear a little bit more oomph. Now I can hear it, and it sounds right, it sounds good to me. You might not be able to hear it coming through your speakers. But one thing I can do if I want to is if I hit compare, it's going to take, before I made any changes, it's going to give me the compare. Take the compare off. So maybe you can hear it. I certainly can on my end, and it feels richer to me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, yes, I feel good about that. I'm going to hit write, and I'm going to write that. And I now have my two sequences set up properly. I've got sequence number 1 set up. I've got the arpeggiator set up for timbre 1 and timbre 2. So now is the not so fun time, depending on how much you like to do pattern programming, for the drums. So now we're ready for the last part of building our program. And some people might think the most important part, which is the drums. Now you don't have to, within a program, you don't have to have a drum timbre. You'll see as you scroll through the many different programs of the Radius that there are lots of different patterns that don't have drums. You know, this one right here is all arpeggiator, 2 timbres assigned to the same arpeggiator with step sequence 1 and 2. So there's plenty of examples out there where you don't have to have drums. But if you do, it's my practice, you could do it however you want, to have your drums be timbre 4. So in this particular case, we're going to add drums, but if you'll notice, by going back to our program of P16, we only have 2 timbres. We are not going to add the drums to timbre 3. We're going to leave that blank, and we're going to come to timbre 4. So this is the process to do the drums. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure when we go into edit, we go back to our page and we go to our timbre, and we come down and we turn timbre 4 on. If we don't have timbre 4 on, the next step is going to be problematic, and it's going to frustrate you. So make sure that this is turned on. You can tune it to whatever you want. I recommend you don't tune it. The reason why is if you come over here and you start turning this and you go and you grab different sounds, it will load the last sound that you had pulled in, the last timbre from the different program, and it will also load in all of its effects and all of its filters. And that's going to, in some cases, if you, for example, you happen to have a sound that you put on there that had a lot of master effect delay in it, you are going to then have that delay put on top of your drums, and it's going to sound like on your bass kick, you're going to have, triple bass kicks, and you're going to not know why. So I would not mess with this at all. We've just come down here to timbre. We've just turned it on. That's all we need to do. The next thing that we want to do is we want to come to our common tab. And within our common tab, you'll notice that common page, tab number 2 is drum timbre. And drum timbre by default is off because you don't have to put a drum in. If you want to, this is how you do it. You come here and you say, I want to turn it on, but then it's going to ask you which timbre you want to assign it to in the current program. We want to assign it to timbre 4. That's my practice. I have 3 open. I don't want to stick it in 3 because I might want to put a different sound in there later. So I want to keep them separated. The next thing you'll do is you'll come through and you'll choose the kit. Now, there are 16 different drum kits that you can choose from that the Radius already has pre-programmed. There are also ways, actually there's more. I'm sorry, there are 24 that it gives you. And then you have places you can build your own drum kit. So there are ways you can go through and you can actually, much like with your timbres, where you're choosing from other programs, you can actually choose different sounds from different drum kits to pull in. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to choose one that's already here. I'm going to choose number 9, Analog 88. I'm going to keep everything exactly like it is here. I'm not going to make any changes to it. I'm going to keep it like it is. And I've got that set. So when I come here and I go back to my timbre page, it will now show that I have Analog 88 on, and it will also show that little drum icon there that shows that I've got drums loaded into that particular timbre. So I feel good about that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to exit. And when I exit, you'll notice that the drum is now over here. and I'm going to write this, and I'm going to say, yes, I feel good about that. Let's write it. Okay, we have our analog 88 drum kit assigned to our Tamper 4. We got our drum cymbal there, we've got our arpeggiator on minimal, ARP Tamper 1, we've got our ARP noise on Tamper 2 for sequencer 1, so it's now time to assign our sequencer number 2 to our drums. Really quick, before we do that, before we start doing any editing, we want to, I keep saying this because this is a mistake I make all the time, we want to come back and we want to make sure that we've selected the right timbre. If I were to have left that on 1, gone into edit and started to change parameters, it would apply them to timbre 1, which would change, it would take the arpeggiator off of my timbre 1, and it would have put the step sequencer 2 on, and I would not have gotten the results that I wanted. So before I do anything, I want to make sure that I've selected 4. Also, before I enter into mode of adding the sequencer, I want to turn off the sounds for timbre 1 and 2. I only want to be dealing with my drums right now. I've got the other sounds I think sounding like I want. When I play them all together, if it's off, I can come back and change that. But I want to make sure that I get this set up properly. So 4, make sure I'm good, I'm going to hit edit. So now, only thing that's selected is that. I'm good, I can see that on my page for timbre. And now I want to come down here to step sequencer 2, the common tab, not selected, obviously, because I haven't turned step sequencer 2 on. Before I turn step sequencer 2 on, I want to cover something on drums. So if you remember, we loaded into our Tamper 4 analog 88. And we have the ability to sound off and to actually trigger those drums here with our buttons. If you are using Radius standalone and you don't have a controller, you would do that. But it's important you keep something in mind when you're using the Radius by itself. When I'm here and I'm hitting my controller, I don't get any sounds because drums are only 16. There's our friend 16 again. Only 16 places within a drum kit. You have 16 places for drums within a kit. You can change those around. We're not going to cover that, but you can come up with your own custom kits. But for right now, we are going to just focus on the 16 we have, and they are down in the lower register. So if you look down here, my bass drum and 16 keys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then nothing else from there. So the assignment of those 16 are important. If you happen to be on an octave 0 here, you have this set to keyboard, and you're hitting these buttons, you're saying, oh, my drums don't work. And you're not getting, and you're frustrated because you don't know. You actually have to step down a couple of octaves. There's C4, because I've tamed down C3, I hear the very top end. I'm basically only have my last few sounds. What I want to do is come down to this so I can get down to my bass. This is where you would control all the rest of those. Just to test to make sure you can hear them. But the idea is you want to get a sense for kind of where those drums are, because right now you're going to make note of, well, I got 2 basses. I got this one, and I got this one. On the keyboard, it's this one and this one. I'm just going to use the standard bass. So I know that that is drum number 1. And then I'm going to come up and I'm going to say, okay, well, maybe I want to get a hi-hat in here. Just a quick hi-hat. Oh, but that's probably as I go through and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I like 9. 9 sounds good. So 9 is the next one, and then I'm going to look for other symbols that I want. So I know the ones that I want. I've already picked them out, but you'll go through and you'll find when you're going through this or you're playing with the keys, you'll find out which drum sounds that you want. So that's super important before you get any further. Zone also, you would want to set, this is C1 to G9, so the whole keyboard, even though there's only 16 sounds that are mapped to it, so setting a zone doesn't really matter for building out your drum kit. Just keep that in mind. If you think that this is how you assign the range for the keys, you actually don't. This is specific to the timbre. So let's come out of this. Let's go back to our pages. I'm going to go back to step sequencer 2. It's not turned on for timbre 4, which is blinking. Yes, we make sure that we constantly check to make sure we're adding things. We want to make sure this is turned on. We also want to make sure that we have the latch turned on for the drums once we get step sequencer 2 assigned. And now step sequencer 2, the screen comes alive because I have it assigned. I want to turn latch on, and the reason I want to turn latch on is because I want the drum to keep driving after I take my finger off the key. So let's come down here to step sequencer. We'll look at this one. This is going to look very similar to what we saw with our step sequencer 1 and our arpeggiator. Last step of the sequence is 16. Our loop, we're going to have it run in a continuous loop. Our resolution matches our other settings. Drums aren't going to transpose as you go up and down usually, unless you have some sort of special synth drum that you're using to transpose. We're not going to change gate or swing time. And again, this is where you set if you wanted to have this sequence be within certain keys. Right now, any key you touch on the keyboard, from here to all the way up here where you can't see, would activate the sequence number 2. If I wanted to change it to only certain bass keys, this is where I make the change, not in the Tamper. I said earlier, that wasn't where you make the change. This is where you do make change. We're not going to make a change to that. So we're going to come over here to trigger. And this is just like the situation we're in, where we'll come here to trigger, and we will say, oh, hey, look, we've got nothing turned on, but we're going to turn them all on. And the reason we want to turn them all on is because we're going to build up the sound, and much like we did with the ARP noise, we're going to try to get a feel for what the rhythm is and what we want to add to it. So we're going to do that. Another thing I'm going to call out here is the steps. My turning on of the triggers here, it needed something, Radius needed something to say, well, if I'm going to trigger, I have to trigger off of something. So it's going to choose C2 in this particular case. Now, if you're doing something that has melody to it, like you wanted to do a C chord there, for example, you would record the step sequencer differently. You would actually record every single step of the sequence. We're not going to do that because we're doing drums. But the way you would do that, if you were going to do that, before you got everything set up, if we had a certain melody, we would hit this button to start our step sequencer, boom. And then it'd say sure, we'd say yes, we'd hit it. And then from now, recording is live. So if I hit anything on my keyboard, it's going to remember those keys, up to 8 keys. There's our friend 8, 16, 32. It's going to remember 8 keys that it's going to remember for that step of the sequence. But every time you hit the keys, let go, hit it again, the step sequencer is going to move up and it's going to record that sequence. So that's not what you do for drums. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit that to turn it off because that's not what we're doing. I'm going to come over here and also point out that for this, you'll notice here our velocity is set to key. We don't want that. So we're going to do just like we did with our other step sequencer and our arpeggiator, where we're going to set it. And we really want the drums to drive, but not be overpowering. So this is, you can mix it after the fact. I'm going to come in and I'm going to put my drums in at 120. That's what I want them to go at. So now let's go through this and let's set them all at 120. There we go. God, I wish there was an easy way to do that, but I'm not aware of it. So we've got all of our steps put at the right time. Now we're going to overwrite the value that triggers. And the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to come back to trigger, where this is turned on. And instead of note select being on trigger, we're going to choose note select to be drum 1. That was our first bass drum that we decided we wanted to use earlier on. Again, I might have used bass drum number 2, which is a short kick. I'm going to use the long bass kick. So it's bass drum, bass long, that's what I'm going to use. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to turn on my arpeggiator and I'm just going to start a sequence. So I can come down here and I can hit this. And come back to trigger. Now this is not what I want. This is not a very good drum beat, right? Can't dance to it. So I'm going to basically have my drums happen on the first beats of each measure. So pretty steady, 120 beats a minute, 4/4 time. This is pretty good. So now let me start moving some different drum sounds in as I go. Now you'll notice here, I'm triggered. But here, I go to the next drum. It's still beating in the background, but I'm not triggered on any of these drums. If I by chance came back here and decided to turn on, I don't want that. So I'm going to come over here. So I think it was 9 that I said I like that hi-hat sound. So I like 9, and I'm going to throw one in at 1, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, and 15. Yep, I like that. I'm burning a little hot into my amp there. Okay, so the next drum I'm going to do is drum number 11. Turn it up to 11. I'm going to do 3 and 7, 11 and 12. And then let's do 16. And let's do 7, 11, 13, and 15. Yep, so I like that. That feels good. So I'm going to hit this button to stop it. I'm going to turn it back on because I want Step Sequencer 2 to be on with the program. I want Latch to be turned on because I want that to be on with the program. I'm good with my level of my drum kit throughout. If you'll notice here, Radius has now overwritten for my bass drum C2 everywhere, C sharp 2, and G2, G sharp 2. So if you'll notice on the things that are turned on, there are triggers. And for this step number 10, nothing's turned on, so nothing gets triggered, there's no keys pressed. So again, this is when you get to step recording and you put the keys in, that's how it records it the same way. So there you go. So now I'm going to feel good about what I've done. I haven't saved so far. I've broken one of my own rules about saving. I should have saved after I did something earlier, but I'm not. I'm going to go ahead and exit. I'm going to verify that I have Step Sequencer 2 turned on, assigned to Tamper 4, and it's a drum timbre. I'm going to turn 1 and 2 back on. Don't save before you turn those guys back on, because that's not going to work. And it's remembering here the original value was those were turned on, so that's fine, that's good. I'm going to write, I'm going to say yes, and I've now saved it. I'm going to come back here, just turn this way, load up this one, then come back to 16, and you'll see everything's saved the way that I had it. So now, if I take a quick tour of this program, I'm on Timbre 1 selected, Arpeggiator on, I'm good, Arpeggiator. If I go here, I'm on Timbre 2, Step Sequencer 1 is turned on, and it's on, no latch. If I go to 3, there's nothing happening. If I go to 4, I'm Step Sequencer 2, I'm on, I'm latched, I've got drums, I'm good. So now, with the levels that I've turned on, for each of the key level or key velocities, I should be pretty much where I need to be for this particular sound. So let's go ahead, I'm going to use this to trigger it. As I said, I'm going to try to use that more than my controller. And we will hit our C4. Drums are still playing because I took my key off the finger, my finger off the key. All right, that's our program. I hope you guys have found the parts. I doubt anybody's going to watch this all the way through, but if you found the parts that are helpful to you, that's great. As I said, a lot of this stuff exists within the the manual, but seeing it actually done live sometimes help. I know I'm a visual learner that way. I wish I would have come across a video like this. Like I said, there's a lot of Radius videos out on YouTube that are good to give you a sense of the sounds. A couple of my favorites, maybe I'll throw into the links below. There's a couple of people out there as well that even I'll show this one to you because it's fun. There's a guy named Marcus out there that created a great program if you happen to be into synthesizer music and I think it's 8, yeah. So Blade Runner, one of our favorite movies if you like synth music, and Vangelis and all of the amazing things he did before. I mean, even before this stuff was possible, he was doing some pretty incredible things. But this is a really great program. Okay, turn this on. That's right. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it. And depending on how many people or how few people see this, I might do something later on with other step sequencers with melodies, or possibly something with the Radius sound editing software. All right, guys. Thanks a bunch.